thank you, everyone. And thank you, Iraida. Thank you, the Human Cultural Center, for bringing to us Anjanette Delgado, who's really a writer, a journalist, and also kind of a TV mogul. I mean, you have been featured in Vogue, in NPR, in the New York Times. You know, I always read that section, the love letters, where I want to read yours. I never miss that section because it's always so good. The Kenyan Review, the Hong Kong Review, and the Boston Review, HBO. She has been everywhere and has 2 novels. But maybe I should present to you Anjanette, and she will tell us about her trajectory. Anjanette, you have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Isabel, for having me, for inviting me, for reading the book, for wanting to talk about it, and for wanting to share it with the people who will be viewing this interview. As you said, I'm the writer of 2 novels, and a little bit after publishing the 2nd novel, I felt like I needed to go a little deeper, and I stepped back from writing novels, and I used short pieces to help myself learn what I didn't know that I didn't know. You might see my dogs come around and try to steal the camera every so often.
I love dogs.
So, and that's when I started publishing all those things you mentioned, right? Working with literary journals and reviews and just putting my work out there. Novels are sort of like this thing, this hole that you go into, right? A different world. And I think that prepared me for the book that we're going to talk about tonight, which is, and I have it right here, so I'll show it because I'm very proud of it.
But let me say a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So
and
it's
then we will ask questions.
Sure.
As she's holding it, it's called Home in Florida.
Home in Florida, Latinx Writers and the Literature of Uprootedness. And it's an anthology, so it's made up of short sections. And so that's why I mentioned that, after the 2 novels, just going back and trying to relearn things from scratch with shorter pieces, which aren't easier, by the way, really prepared me for taking on the project that University of Florida Press proposed, and coming up with this anthology made up of short works of so many great writers, which we're going to talk about today, hopefully.
And a little bit about the anthology has writers from different times, many countries in Latin America. Their common language is they are all native speakers of Spanish.
Almost.
But yeah, there's also people that were born here from families that were Hispanic. Yes. And so it's a mix, which, I mean, really for me this is the job of an editor that's very creative, because usually when you have an anthology, you have pieces of all one type, but you mix them in. You have from Reynaldo Arenas to Ana Menendez. And you have 42 pieces and 33 different writers. And the men are a little, yes, you have more men than women, right?
You might have, I don't know.
No, I have counted them.
We'll get into how they got chosen.
Yes.
No, sex wasn't gender wasn't one of the
one of the criteria.
No, it wasn't.
No.
It wasn't the balance that I was looking for. But there is a very good sampling of women writers from different countries. Obviously, as in all anthologies, right? You want to include it all, and there's always something will be missing no matter what. But it was important to me to have a mix from different countries, from different stages of uprootedness, if you will, rather than other things, right? And then the other stuff was just organic, right? They ended up being different ages and different genders, some queer writers, some not, some people with a different experience, right? Exile as opposed to leaving
immigration
by choice, right? Although I don't know who leaves by choice. I think there's always a circumstance I always say that Florida is a place of uprootedness, and many of the uprooted are not Latinos and they're not immigrants. They're from other states.
New Yorkers.
New Yorkers, right? They're from other stages of their life. They come for health. So their own health uprooted them, made them move. You know, we are all uprooted in some way from something.
Well, we're gonna get to you a little later. Yeah. Okay, when you say uprooted, you know, and I'm thinking of my work on exiles and displacement, and I thought, desterrado. How does that sound to you as an equivalent? You have said
I mean, there are a lot of words.
Desarraigo.
Desarraigo, although in Spanish, desarraigo implies that you don't love whatever you become desarraigado from, right? It implies that you left it.
Yes,
that you,
more voluntary.
That you separated in some way, and that is not the case. I don't know that there is a perfect word for it. I think they all fit, but none of them are quite it. But that's precisely because our stories are so different.
Yes.
Even among my Cuban friends who are all share exile, right? As a
or our parents, you know, parents,
or their parents
by now.
Right. Well, Cuban American is different, but in the case of Cuban friends, meaning Cuban who were born there, all the exiles are not the same, right?
No.
Not at all. I mean, some of them came before, some of them came thinking that they were going to return right away, right? Some of them are Peter Pan kids. Some of them had resources and had left a little bit earlier, even before some other, you know, there's just so many. In my case, for example, I'm Puerto Rican and I was born a citizen. I did not have the choice. I don't know what I would have chosen or not. But I can tell you that I'm an exile of gender violence. Gender violence is the number one reason I left Puerto Rico and moved to the state, to the colonizing nation, which implies a whole lot of other conflicts, right? Living in the place that colonized where you were born. So, you know, it's all different. It's all different.
So you decided when you were doing your anthology that everybody fit in a way because of that. If they had that experience in common, which is being displaced or uprooted, they qualified.
Well,
that's the central.
Yeah, I did want to. It is about Latinx writings. Though in my intro, I'm a lot more broad in who I embrace into the circle of the book, meaning readers and writers. You are part of the book, even though you don't have a piece in the book. You are part of the book, right? So Florida was definitely a standpoint of one of the criteria. The people didn't necessarily have to live here, but they had to have a history with Florida. So for example, even though Judith Ortiz-Coffer did not consider herself a Floridian. In fact, she left because she plain hated it, right? And she found her home in Georgia.
Is she's still with us?
No, she's not with us anymore.
I used to teach her work. Yeah,
really?
Her works. Oh yeah.
So powerful. So powerful to this day. I just so relevant. Judith lived and worked in Florida for 10 years. And it was where she really, I would say, became a teacher, you know, and went a lot of the things that we're still going today. And then she made a choice. She made a choice not to be here. And that's part of it, right? That's part of those places that you transit through on the way to somewhere else. The case with Reinaldo Arenas. You know, he was here for a while and, you know, it wasn't his jive, and New York was.
His piece, the piece that you included, is fantastic because it really it fits into the work because it talks about, it's like a metafiction inside the book. He's talking about writing and the characters talking to him. It's a wonderful piece because it just reminded me of the dialogue between the pieces that you have here. They are different pieces, but they talk to one another.
Yeah, you know? It's not one of his better known. And one day when you talk to my
editor, I never read it before, and I teach Arenas and I write about
pieces, right? It's not his you know, his, I think his the movie and his memoir kind of overshadowed other work for some people. But isn't it incredible how the whole uprootedness that he felt, you know, not only him, but his characters.
Yes, yes.
Oh, there we are. Come on.
They're welcome. They're welcome. Bring them in.
Well,
Just
they can be a lot. But I love that piece, and we worked really hard to get that piece. We were indebted to the team at Penguin Random House and his former agent Tom Colchi for helping me to find it and to find the people who could allow me to get the right.
That was one of my questions as to how did you get all these people to contribute, because you have a lot of pieces and they're not insignificant, they're not short, they're, you know, some of them are long short stories.
Yeah, the short answer is I begged.
But see the energy that you have, you know, it's just the energy.
The energy is part of it, but also, I mean, I really begged. I remember there was one of the notes that I sent inviting literally ended with, you know, I'll be really sad if you say no, please say yes. I mean, some of my writers make fun of me to this day. Part of it was begging, I won't lie. Part of it was the pandemic. Putting it together in 2020. Yeah, 2020 was the beginning, like March was a bad month. April was when I started writing my invites and thinking about who I wanted to include. And so it was a weird little summer, that first summer. People had just gone home. And, you know, New York was just a ghost town, right? Well, I don't know. I don't live there. I live in Boston. But I'm a Boston person. I mean, in the news, I think New York was kind of one of the first places that we saw in the US. And so I think all of that in a way kind of influenced, you know, writers wanted to connect. I think people welcomed the invite, the deadline to do something and feel you had something to do, you had something to turn in, right? You know, for you, that was first too. You never had an anthology, right? Or have you had other anthologies? I had guest edited journal issues. My first was the Hong Kong Review. I edited their third number. I'm on their board, and it was previous to the pandemic, and it was kind of difficult, right? Because the Hong Kong Review is an international publication with a whole lot of other constraints. And so that was a different kind. And there we were looking for the more international, the better. So I had an interview with Isabel Allende, but I also had unknown writers who had never published before. And so that issue was an anthology of writing. Right, because different pieces from different people and then with one common uniting thread, if you will. In that case, it was global voices. I see. And literature. And it was also multi-genre, by the way. It was poetry, nonfiction, and fiction together in one tome. Just like your book now, Home in Florida, you have pieces, the poetry by Richard Blanco, you have the poetry, well, you have poetry, and then you have a lot of segments that are not fiction. They are like memoirs or essays. Autobiographies. That's we have lyric essays, which are sort of a mix between nonfiction and poetry. Jadira Peralta has a fantastic lyric essay in the piece. So I didn't know that, because when I saw the Hong Kong review, since I've never really had an issue in my hand, is it in the libraries in the United States? I mean, can you get it? Distributed everywhere, and they have subscriptions in the US. It's a great. I will make sure to go to the Boston Public and find you there too. Yes, I encourage you to. They're fantastic. So this was your second anthology? Really my second grouping. I've done groups of other things, right? And for television, putting stories together, for example, into specials. I executive produced a show that was for the anniversary of 9/11 for Telemundo Network. It was hours long, and it was, again, a compilation of many different kinds of stories. Person, not first person, journalistic, poetic, musical even. I like the mix. I think that storytelling can, and especially in this multimedia world, right? There are so many ways to tell stories, even on the page, that feel different by a sense of their rhythm, the form that you use.
Don't you think that literature these days has really picked up from the media? In other words, film is sort of introducing itself into the works. You have a vignette, and then you have a jump, and then you have, you know, like it used to. I mean, there was a time in the boom that those writers of the boom, the 60s to the 70s, they were really borrowing techniques from cinema. Okay,
Right.
and then the novels got very realistic these days. I mean, I could notice as I'm getting, you know, pretty old in teaching.
Yeah, I think of Manuel Puig, Boquilla Pintada.
Yeah, Cabrera Infante, who was my person, you know, he did, as his wife said, Guillermo filmaba en la página. You know, he was writing as if he were making a film. And now it's coming back.
Well,
it's coming back.
Here's what because I mean, I read Mavis. I'm trying to remember the last name of Mavis, a short story writer. I mean, if you even go back to like the Paris Review and you read oldish, it's in there. It's just that we as readers had not caught up. So we were, you know, cinema was a special event, right? We went to the cinema and it was separate. And when you went to the cinema, you watched the movie, right? You were a person. You didn't go to the, you know, you didn't go to the cinema to smoke or to do anything, you know, or kiss your boyfriend or anything like that. You went to see the movie and it was an event. Whereas now everything is mixed. You can be watching a movie anywhere while you're doing other things, listening, right? So we're constantly multitasking. And so audio-visual influence has become, I think, more part of our language.
Exactly. And the
now
students,
know that's what we're seeing.
The students have changed that way. They are now ahead. I mean, I had to explain what a flashback was, what a flash forward was.
Right.
Then, let's say in the well, I started teaching in the 80s.
Right.
Yeah, and now the students know it. They know it because they're used to seeing it on TV, on Netflix and things like that. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. And going back to relate it to what we're doing here, the pieces talk to one another. Different genres, as you say, are more fun because people now can read in different genres. They don't expect something to begin in point A and end. You know, there is mix, as you say, this multitasking of reading.
And also, I think that it's kind of the magic trick of stories, right? The reality is that we are the ones who've created genres, you know, and we've created neat little names for separating this or that. And even though, sure, there are some techniques that apply more to some things than others, and things that we don't think about when we're doing poetry that we think about when we're doing reportage, for example, the reality is that a story has no such separation. Narrative is narrative. If you notice the poetry in the anthology, it's narrative poetry in that a very specific story. It's not an experimental story. It's not a story that you can't make a piece.
It's like the grandmother of Richard Blanco, where they couldn't talk to each other because they had different languages. That was really good.
You know, the way that he translates for his mother, and another one of his piece of the book is the one to his mom. And in the end, it's a story, and I think we get more enjoyment when we understand all that's coming into telling us the very same story that could be told in a short story, but it's told instead in a lyrical essay that jumps back and forth, and like you say, borrows from cinema, casting, graphic novels, you know, so much of it.
So do you ever think that you would become a literary critic? Because it seems to me that not only do you write, but you understand it in a way that you can explain it.
I do review a lot of books. I think in the last 2 years, I've written maybe 80 book reviews for the New York Journal of Books, but also for the Women's Review of Books, which was a dream of mine to write for them. It's a publication that I admire for the work that they did with the second wave of feminism and before. And, you know, just their intention to review books by women and books with a feminist slant, right? And they've been doing this before it was popular, way before Me Too was a thing, as my students would say. But yeah, I am a student of the forms. I love form. I love creating something beyond not just the story or the content, but how do I tell you that story? What did I use? Did I use light music? Did I give you a soundtrack and you could hear it as you were reading? Did it inform what you felt, right? And it has a lot to do with the anthology, because everybody asked me, well, how did you organize it? Did you do it by country? Did you do it by... No, I didn't.
Yeah, that was a big question I had here that I have discarded now because we've talked about it. But one of the questions I had that has to do with women and feminism, how, when you talk about being displaced, uprooted, the women, do they feel displacement different than the men? What do you think, your writers, yourself?
They feel it differently. I don't know that the experience is any different, but the way that they feel it, I think, is different. And I obviously, I don't know all the stories of displacement in the world, but I know the ones that I read to come up with this selection. And yeah, I think that you can notice how women tend to anchor more, to anchor and to create a home, a structure for their displacement. They tend to want to explain it. They tend to want to clarify it, sometimes justify it. Whereas in some of the men in the book, you'll see, have no problem appearing misanthropic, slightly misanthropic. They have no problem. That's not the job of, you know, of the story that they're telling. The story that they're telling, it's about telling their story and making sure you get it and making sure you know what it is like for them. They don't feel the need necessarily to put it in too much context. An exception could be a piece, Miami is Cuban, by Raúl Pico, where he does anchor it. But it's more from a standpoint of understanding history and wanting to make sure that you understand where he falls in a continuum of Cuban history, right? And displacement. So that's the only reason. But other than that, you find Carlos Pintado, another Cuban writer, his piece is just surreal. He doesn't
I don't think I gotten to him.
Towards the end of the piece, Carlos is most known as a poet, but he's lent his poems to music, to dance. He is multisensory in his approach, and so the piece is a piece during the pandemic. It's a gorgeous piece, and I bring it to that example that you say because nothing is explained, and he doesn't need to explain anything. He's made up this thing, and he trusts the reader to understand the context.
Yeah, I also feel that displaced women are more centered on the reality that surrounds them. In other words, if things are not fair, they're more militant about expressing themselves. Even you have here social justice things that you have written and published.
Many.
While the men want to talk about their stories more. I think that it seems to me, from reading Cuban literature of exile, not so much. I cannot say this spread you have here of Latin Americans, whether that would be true. But that's why I was curious, to say, well.
Oh, I think it's definitely different in the way they approach writing it, the way they approach writing it, and maybe because that's how they felt it, right? But I'll give you an example that separates from that, deviates from that, and it's Achio Ovejas.
Sí.
So, told me from the beginning, I'm going to go surreal here, and I don't know what it is. I don't want a label. I think it's fiction. but it's obviously fiction, but there's a lot of nonfiction. And, you know, she herself didn't want to put the label. And you see there where she doesn't feel the need to explain. And she has consciously, she freed herself and said, you know what? This is not about, you know, the fact that Latinx is in the book is not about being more Latino than anybody. I don't have to explain my Latino-ness or my queerness or my, whatever it is in her case, a Cubanness. I don't need to explain any of that. I'm going to have a lot of fun. And
yeah, she's gifted. She's a gifted writer. Even the beginning, the one when she was a little girl, we came out of Cuba so I could dress like, you brought me from Cuba so I could dress like this, where she has a conflict with the parents. And it is really an excellent story. Again, not explaining, just dialoguing with
the same thing that other gifted writers like Ana Menendez achieved.
Yeah, Ana.
In a different way, right? Ana is very much a writer who is into the story. And, you know, her first
the German Shepherd in Cuba was a German
Shepherd is to the story, but she also has just a very big sense of where what she writes will land and what it will say, not just now, but later.
Well, the selection that she gave you is a novel now. And it is the theme of your anthology again, because she has this rooming house where people from all nationalities share displacement. That's what, so there she has your book also in a little nutshell of that. So it's also an excellent selection for you.
Ana brought 3 other things. You know, she has Ukrainian family. She has family in Russia. She was in Ukraine actually when we last spoke, not in person. So I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know. But so she brought a different sensibility to the whole question of displacement. She also brought her journalism experience, getting stories from people. And with Ana, something really fun happened. So when she handed me her work, she handed it in with artwork. She's an accomplished artist. And so these paintings were so amazing. I told her, I want to buy these. And we ended up ultimately not putting them in the book because it would have been, she was the only one who had artwork. But I wanted to, because it was so amazing how she had brought so much of her senses to bear into this world that she creates in that apartment building, right?
Yeah, but that whole idea that you don't have to be Cuban or Puerto Rican, you could be from anywhere and you feel the same way. I mean, I think Ukrainians will be the next group here that will be writing eventually, that will be feeling that way. Unfortunately, you know, I don't think that we're going to be going home real soon. But anyway, we can't. Let me just, can I go through some of the questions I had prepared?
Of course. Any and all questions.
Anyway, in the meantime, what is it that, is there something we haven't touched that you would want to bring up right now?
Sure. So there's, we were talking before about how I arranged the anthology and where I brought all these things that we were talking about, all these influences to bear. And so the way that I arranged the anthology was emotional. Which is a little bit the way you produce television and the way you produce movies, right? You don't have 10 scenes of horror back to back. You have to have, you know, the mind, the heart that can't deal with all this. It kind of has to go up and down in a rhythm. And that's how writers of cinematic works make sure to get to you emotionally. They prepare you for something that you're going to see later on. They set up things and they make things more intense or less intense as a way to work with you so that you're participating as you're watching, you're participating and making what you will of these rhythms. And so I feel like uprootedness is essentially that. It's a process. It's not a thing. I'm not uprooted yesterday and now I'm not uprooted anymore. There's not a magical thing. Not even, you know, for people who have gotten their citizenship, not even the day that they got their citizenship necessarily create an end to the nostalgia or to certain other things of displacement, right? And I have felt not uprooted from, I felt unuprooted from for a long time. And suddenly, when I was stronger to understand my leaving and all the circumstances, I began to feel uprooted, and I began to miss a part of me that I had silenced and pushed aside, right? So it's a process. It's like I say in the intro, it's a constellation of stars, jagged lines, you know, they're not straight, they're not smooth. And so I arranged it in that way in a hope of taking the reader with me on a road of different moments and levels of emotion, of loss, of gaining. There's gaining also. I wish that it could be some kind of a multimedia project, because there was so much that I would have added.
Okay, so let me just go 1 minute. We talked about the criteria. We understand it now. We know that. I love that emotion part that you just talked about, because to write and have the principle structuring a book be an emotion never really occurred to me that way. You know, I always think in terms of themes. You know,
Yeah.
I want to, you know, such as displacement. But like you said, displacement is a feeling, you know.
Exactly. Well, and distance is also a feeling, right? So for example, there are about 8 pieces in the book that were translated into English. These are authors who had never published in English. So they're fantastic writers, but and they live here and you don't know, nobody knows about them, right? We know about them in the Spanish language community because they are publishing in Spanish, but these are smaller books with smaller distribution. And normally when somebody does an anthology about Latinx work, they don't go looking for people to translate, right? It's more expensive. Right. And also they're less known. And so why would you go out of your way? But for me, it was one of the things that I'm most grateful to the press, to University of Florida Press for, is they invested in getting these unknown authors translated. The cover is by a Cuban painter, local Cuban painter. Her name is Nereida Garcia Ferraz.
Oh yeah, Nereida.
Her work is right now at the Lowe's and in many other museums. And this was a painting that I had seen. I had visited her house, her studio, and I had seen it. And so she told me that this was Juana, her mom, who passed away a few years ago, you know, arriving in Chicago, not knowing, you know, Nereida and her family. Her dad they had arrived first, so her mom arrived alone later. She was able to leave later. And this is her. And I remember
beautiful. It's a beautiful.
Stephanie was able to work with Nereida to get the cover. And I feel that it just brings everything together. You know, this mother arriving at this huge city, like Chicago in this case, with all these kinds of buildings and feeling completely uprooted.
You feel the emotion of displacement in this woman sitting here, sort of.
Totally.
Totally. It is. It's there. It's fantastic. Okay, let me. Oh yeah, the last part of it. Then it will be. I have it in Spanish. I said Puerto Rico, tu país. Right?
Yeah.
Why not more Puerto Rican writers in your book? Because.
Sure. So a couple of things. One of the very fair criticisms that some people have leveled at the book, con toda razón, I say it in Spanish, is that it doesn't reflect the entire state of Florida. And it doesn't for good reason. Not that there aren't any Latinx writers in Northern Florida. There are, and some of them are in the book, but not as many. So if you were really going to try to be representative of what this is like, it's going to be disproportionate. You know, include Southern Florida. If it weren't, I probably wouldn't have been a good editor for it, because I don't know as much about Northern Florida as I would. So I did make an effort to have all those perspectives, because I wanted that. It's the same living in Tampa as living in Miami. Tampa is not the best example, but for example, Gainesville, where our press is, right? Because here I am surrounded by people who understand my background, and in Gainesville, not necessarily. So those are different experiences, and I did include some, but I did want to be representative. So if I had had a lot more Puerto Ricans, I think I have like 5 or 6, which is like a 15%, it wouldn't have been representative. Maybe now it will be, because a lot of Puerto Ricans have begun to move in the past. You know, once the pandemic got a little bit under control, a lot of people began to immigrate even more because of Maria, really. And if more didn't come before it, it had to do with the pandemic, kind of stopped it a little bit. But now, I mean, Florida is now the number one state for Puerto Ricans, displacing New York, which it was, you know, the historic.
Amazing.
But so the first reason had to do with my wanting to be representative. So there are a lot of women, because if most of the Latinx communities are in South Florida, then most of that community is still Cuban, even though that has changed recently, still majority Cuban. And also because I think that Puerto Rico is such a complex situation. I mean, the last colony of the Americas, right? That it kind of deserves a different book.
Yes, that's one of your projects to come.
I think so, because you know, displacement is a general topic in a sense where you really shouldn't go into very specific, political, complex, decades old, you know, things. If you notice, even though in the Cuban pieces there is politics, none of the pieces are really, really political from that standpoint. They're not trying to make the politics, not because it's not there, it's in all the subtext, it's in my beliefs, it's in everything I do and say. But displacement was the focus. The exile being the catalyst for that, but not displacement being the reason to talk about exile, but exile being the reason to talk about displacement.
As we're getting to a close now, I had asked Anjanette to have something for us to hear her work. And I really don't know exactly what she's going to read, but she agreed to it. So here she is.
So I wish I would read from my authors, because everything that is in this book is so much better than my intro of it. But I think I can share some of what I wrote in trying to explain to others what the book was trying to do, and also who we are, right? These Latinx people. This is the first and the only so far anthology that gathers Latinx voices in one book, Latinx writings in English from Florida. There are no other anthologies who do that. So just explaining that context was important to me. So I'm gonna read from the intro. We might draw 2 points, one located at the start on the left side of what will be an uneven line holds your recently uprooted, the soon to returns, the just arrived, the what have I done's, souls with turmoil tattooed in indigo on the whites of their eyes, their gaze always lost, their eyelids heavy from having to look inward to find what they never imagined they'd miss this much. If they are writers, they do not write, not now. They first need a job, a physical address, a first paycheck with which to send money back home, not now. Why write? Nobody knows them here. Who would translate and publish them? It's too soon. They've had no time to create community. They are surviving, and even those rules, they are still learning. The other dot goes on the opposite end of the spectrum, the right side, where you have the people you think of when you hear the term Latinx. Many are second generation. The rest have been here long enough. They may or may not speak Spanish. They have jobs and speak English better than most, and in the worst of cases, certainly enough to get by. They have made a choice in their hearts this time, or their parents made it for them before they were born. If they are writers, you'll have heard about their writing. Not just because they are widely published and reviewed, recognized, as is the case with the majority of the less recent emigres in this book, but because they've been here long enough to have found their people, other writers. They have a voice, and any sadness has been tempered, processed, written, and given a drawer. Sometimes close to the front door, sometimes in the most hidden of bedrooms. Between the two ends of this spectrum I've tried to describe for you are lines jaggedly connected, a zigzag of them teeming with stars, each in a unique spot on the road to belonging, and shifting daily in one direction or the other. To many of the writers in this book, Florida was destiny. They were not supposed to come here, or if they were born here, they were supposed to have left a long time ago. Some indeed left and were back before they knew it. Others ended up here by mistake, or their parents did, and Florida, whichever one of its corners, but more commonly the southern one, became a temporary place for waiting until it was safe to go back to where they came from. Others left unable to find their dreams, but most importantly themselves here. Of course, for those who stayed, it wasn't an easy decision. There was racism, there still is. It used to be in the signs reading, no Cubans, no dogs, common in Miami Beach in the 70s and 80s. Now it is in the voice of the potential landlord who hangs up before you can tell her you also speak English. There were riots stemming from the same racism, one directed at others, most often African Americans. There was confusion and sometimes corruption born of the mix of dreams and heat. Look at them, test, the rest of the country seems to say at times. Is Florida even part of the United States? It absolutely is. Home to 21.5 million people, out of which 5.8 million, 27% are Latinos, according to preliminary numbers of the 2020 census. That is diversity, and diversity is messy.
Thank you, and thank you very much. And I would like the audience to join us for a question and answer period. There will be a link for you to transfer to the question and answer session. That will be right after this. It's been a pleasure, a tremendous pleasure to talk to you. And thank you to the Centro Cultural Cubano who has provided the space for us.
Thank you so much for having me.